We're going to be in Luke chapter 7, as we just read this morning. I'm sure you have noticed that over the last few Sundays, we've been examining passages that pertain to the encounters that Jesus has as recorded for us in the Gospels. And there's some background here that I want to address. I want to convey to you that I think might be helpful for us to understand what I'm up to here. In the first century, whenever a rabbi who, like Jesus was at the time, a rabbi would travel around and he would have disciples. He would have a group of people that would follow him around. And the purpose of that was twofold. Number one, the disciples were interested in coming to learn and know what the rabbi knew. And this is something that was expressed in terms of sitting at the feet of the rabbi. This was a phrase that was used to depict that. You sit at the feet of the rabbi and you listen to the rabbi's teaching, because part of your objective was to know what the rabbi knows. But it doesn't stop there. There was another expression that was used to describe discipleship in the first century. It was this idea, walking in the dust of the rabbi. And this symbolized, it pertained to the idea that not only do you want to know what the rabbi knows, but you want to be like the rabbi. You want to become like the rabbi. And so you're following him, walking behind the rabbi. And as it were, as the dust is kicked up in following him, and it attaches itself to you. So this is a symbolic representation of not only knowing the rabbi, what the rabbi knows through his teaching, but observing the rabbi and following after him in the sense of patterning your life after him. And this is clearly portrayed in the New Testament, is it not? Isn't it? Yes, it is. We're supposed to be followers of Jesus. As Christians, we don't get saved by following Jesus, but we get saved by faith in Christ's sacrifice and atoning work for us. But once that happens, we begin the path of discipleship, where we begin to grow in our knowledge and understanding of Christ and all that he wants for us and wants us to be. And this is called discipleship, where Jesus says, "Follow me," to his disciples. He says it to the fishermen, "Follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." He says it to Matthew, the tax collector, "Follow me," and Matthew leaves his tax booth and follows him. So we have all these examples of that. And so it's important not only to see the teachings and understand the teachings of Jesus, but also to observe his encounters with people. It helps us to understand how we can model our lives after him, how we can be like Jesus, because he is God in the flesh. He reveals to us what God is like. And so in Luke chapter 7, we are met with one of those encounters. We've already seen over the past couple of weeks the encounters that Jesus had on his way to Jerusalem for the Passover. He met the blind beggar in Jericho, and he also met this guy named Zacchaeus, who was a tax farmer, a tax collector. And we saw how Jesus interacted with those folks. And I think it's important to continue along that path so we can gain more understanding of Jesus in this encounter with the centurion. Now, Ian's going to put up a picture for us. I want us to see where this is happening and how this is happening. So Ian should put up a picture here in a moment. This gives you a map of the area where Jesus spent most of his time in the Galilee region. There are two parts to the Galilee. There's a northern, the upper Galilee and the lower Galilee. This is the upper Galilee. It's right on the Sea of Galilee. There's up in the northwest corner. I don't know if you can see that on the map. You can see the town of Capernaum. Can you see that? It's the northwest part of the Sea of Galilee. There were a number of small fishing villages in that area, and Jesus spent most of his time right there in that small area. It's only an area that spans about 4 miles, starting down at Migdal, which is where Mary Magdalene was from, starting there and working north along the west side of the sea, all the way to the top. You can't really see this very well, but you see the word Beatitudes there at the very top. That's where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. At least that's where we believe it happened. And there's a couple other little villages up there that Jesus talks a lot about, Bethsaida and Chorazin. So the three main villages that Jesus spent a lot of time in were Capernaum, which is where this story takes place, Bethsaida and Chorazin. These were fishing villages. These were places where the primary occupation was fishing. Now, there were other things that they did in these places. In fact, we're going to be in Capernaum soon, and on this trip to Israel. And one of the things that is very notable there there's a field full of big millstones. And so they manufactured millstones in that area as well, because there's a lot of basalt stone up there from the ancient volcanoes. And it's a lot of dark colored rocks. And that's what they used to build their homes there as well. Capernaum is one of those villages that Jesus spent a lot of time in. And the Bible tells us that Capernaum was significant for Jesus. It became his adopted hometown. Because if you remember, while he was in Nazareth, he went to the synagogue and he read from the scroll of Isaiah. And shortly after that, the people in his village rejected him. They tried to kill him, actually. They tried to drive him out and push him over a cliff, but he was able to get out of that situation. And so he left his hometown, and he traveled about a day's walk into the Galilee region. And he ended up at Capernaum, and that was where he kind of set up his home base of operations. Capernaum was also the hometown of some of Jesus' disciples, James and John. That was their hometown. Capernaum is right on the Sea of Galilee. And as you know, James and John were fishermen. Peter and Andrew ended up in Capernaum, although Capernaum wasn't their hometown. These are brothers, sets of brothers. Their hometown was Bethsaida, which is a little farther north. But Peter's mother-in-law lived in Capernaum, and Peter and Andrew eventually moved there. Apparently, Peter's father-in-law passed away, and he moved there to sort of help manage that family. But anyway, the actual name Capernaum means village of Nahum, or Nahum in Hebrew. Village of Nahum probably came into being in the 2nd century BC. The reason why these fishing villages were in that part, or along the northwest part of the Sea of Galilee, is because that's where the fish were. There's a lot of underground springs that, under the sea, that produce a lot of fresh water that bubble up there, and that attracts fish. And so there are schools of fish in that area, and so that's why those villages were established in that area. And so they were very common there. I mentioned Bethsaida. Bethsaida actually means house of fish. That's what the name means. And then if you travel a little further south along the western shore, you come to Migdal. Migdal is the name that means, Magdala is another way of saying it. Actually means fishing tower. And it was a place where they processed fish. They would salt the fish and stack them up in a tower before they would be transported and spread around. Fishing was a really big industry there because there weren't many lakes like this. The Sea of Galilee is a freshwater lake. It's not a sea like an ocean, saltwater. It is about 7 miles wide at its greatest width and about 12 miles from north to south. Okay, and at the top of it, you can see there's a river that flows into it. That's called the Upper Jordan. It comes down from the north, it begins up in Mount Hermon with the melting snow on that mountain peak, and forms a number of streams that come down and form the Jordan River. And that flows in from the north. And then in the south, we have the Lower Jordan that flows out of the bottom of the sea. And that's what goes into the Jordan Valley, all the way down to the Dead Sea. Okay? So that's how the geography works in that part of the world. This, by the way, that Sea of Galilee is about 600 feet below sea level. It sits in a big crack in the ground. It's the Syrian-African rift that runs all the way down to Africa. So it's a huge geological fissure in the ground there. Next slide shows you I think, the strategic importance of why Jesus chose Capernaum as his base of operation. It has to do with the trade routes of the time. You can see there's a number of red lines there which represent different highways that pass through the area. And you can see coming from the north, one comes down just and attaches to another road just above the Sea of Galilee. And that makes its way down. And you can see Capernaum there. It runs right through Capernaum. You see that trade route? It runs right through Capernaum. Then it heads west and ends up going back out towards the sea. That particular trade route was called the Via Marius, or the Way of the Sea. Eventually, it makes its way all the way up to Damascus, and that's, by the way, where the Apostle Paul had his experience with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. It goes all the way up into that region. Why is that important? It was important at that time for a couple reasons. As you know, the Romans were the occupiers of that region. Rome was the dominant world power, and Rome wanted to make sure that they could exploit as much wealth, as much money as they could from the countries that they occupied. And so they set up tax systems throughout the country. And there were different regions that had different leaders that were governing over these different tax areas. Some of you remember, have heard of Herod Antipas or Herod Philip. These were the children of Herod the Great. After Herod the Great died, some of his kids took over, and they divided up the area into different regions, and Rome kind of set up these puppet governments. These particular Herods were over different regions, and you can see the big rift there right through the middle of that map, and that rift actually serves as a divisional line for two different regions, two different tax regions. If on the east side would be Herod Philip, which makes sense. It goes up into the Golan Heights, and north of there, that's where Caesarea Philippi is. Okay, hear that? Caesarea Philippi, Herod Philip's region. Okay, so he farmed out his taxation throughout that area. But then as soon as you cross the Jordan River, you enter into a new tax region, Herod Antipas. Now, these guys, were very interested in getting as much tax money together as they could, because Rome said, this is how much we want out of your region, and whatever else you get is yours to keep. And so, they would set up these, it was all strategic, set up these tax booths where if you were passing through with goods, you had to pay a tax, at these tax booths. And we know that there was a tax booth right outside Capernaum, right on that road that passes by there. So that means there's a lot of movement passing through that area. Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, had a tax booth there at Capernaum. So he was one of these tax collectors. They weren't liked. We've talked about that last time, because Zacchaeus was a tax collector. They weren't liked. They were considered traitors. The people didn't like it at all. I mean, think about it. If you were being occupied by a foreign power and some of the people in your community began to work for them, you wouldn't like that either. And that's what was going on. But they also exploited the people. You see, they exploited the people. And so Matthew had a tax booth there. Jesus went there because he believed there was an opportunity there. A lot of movement passed through there. And Jesus set up his base of operations there strategically so that his ministry, could be effective in working through that. So this is the situation there. But there's more than that. The Romans wanted to safeguard their operations. So they had the Roman military would be present in different sizes and different numbers at different areas. Capernaum was not, considered a huge problem area, and so Rome did not put an entire legion there. They didn't put these legions, in too many places. I think there was one in Syria and one down in Egypt, but they did send smaller groups of soldiers under what are called centurions. And this takes us to this passage, because this is an encounter with the centurions. But centurions themselves were over what's called a century. The Roman military was divided up into different categories, sort of like what we have, where we have platoons and corps and all that kind of stuff. Well, they had their own divisions. And a century was a group of soldiers of about 80 men. And a centurion was over that group of 80 men. And so this group was sent to Capernaum by the Romans with a centurion who was in charge to oversee things, to make sure that things are happening the way they were supposed to. If there are any issues that would arise, the centurion could deal with it. Centurions were not really liked, as you can imagine, because they had a reputation for being brutal. They handled any disturbances, and they handled it with force, you see. So they were not your friends at all. They were not, if you saw a centurion, you would want to avoid the centurion. If you saw a Roman soldier, you kind of want to stay away from them. This is how you would react to them if you were a Jew living at that time. So this story centers around a centurion. And it's rather fascinating because there's something about this centurion that allows him to stand out. From everything I just said about centurions, this guy seems to be different. What is it that's said about him that shows us that he stands out from the typical centurion? Well, for one thing, he has a sick slave and he wants his slave to be healed. The text tells us that he highly values his slave. Now, this is a bit unusual. Why? Well, because slaves were a dime a dozen back then. They weren't very expensive. And so you could buy another one if this one was causing. They were very, very disposable at the time. I think a slave cost about a day's wage back then. So if one slave goes bad, it's like a cog in a wheel. You just replace them with another one. Go buy another slave somewhere. I mean, this is how the system worked. So the life expectancy of these slaves, by the way, was very low. They were lucky if they lived to the age 30. So this just gives you an idea how rough of a life these slaves actually had. But there's something going on here. He highly values this slave. That's the first thing that's of note in the passage. But it's also interesting that the centurion, who has the authority to command anybody who gets a command from him, has to listen to him. He's the authority in the region, in that area, in Capernaum. But what does he do? How does he get Jesus' attention? Does he send one of his soldiers to Jesus? Does he, make a command of Jesus? No. Who goes with the request to Jesus? Did you note that in the text? Who goes? Who carries the request? Yeah, the elders from the synagogue. That's highly unusual. Let's take a look at the verse again. It says, some Jewish elders came to him requesting him to come and save the life of a slave. And notice when they reached Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, he is worthy for you to grant this, because he loves our nation and he has built a synagogue. He has built a synagogue. This is unusual. Centurions didn't usually do this, especially, and more than likely this guy is not from Capernaum. He's been sent down. He's probably from somewhere else in the Roman Empire. Centurions were highly regarded. It took him about 15 years of service in the military to rise to this position. So why in the world does this guy love the nation? What does this tell us about him? Well, it tells us that more than likely, while he's been stationed there, he has come to believe in the God of Israel. He has come to accept the God of Israel. Now, there's a term for these kinds of Gentiles. It's called God-fearers. Now, what that means is that they come to believe in the God of Israel, but they don't completely convert and become Jews. Okay, that's what that means. They don't become Jewish. Yet they see that this is the God that they want to serve. They come to believe in the God of Israel. The book of Acts talks about individuals and groups of people like that as well. So this man, this Gentile, this Roman soldier, this centurion, is a friend of the nation, it says. He loves our nation, you see. He has come to faith in Yahweh, in the Lord. And to demonstrate that, he has also built a synagogue for us. The synagogue in Capernaum was funded by him. Centurions were typically wealthy. They made pretty good money. This is why he can buy a lot of slaves. This is why he can afford to help them build a synagogue there. And this was, not necessarily an uncommon practice in cities across the Mediterranean world at the time. You find examples of this throughout the Roman Empire, where you would have a patron who would do nice things for the city, do nice things for the people because he could afford to. And this would bestow honor upon him. And they would put a plaque up over the building that he funded. We see this today in our own country, don't we? We see different buildings. We see even highways with people's names attached to them in honor of this person. This person was a great person to the community. They did a lot of good things for us, and so we honor them by naming buildings and highways after them. That was a practice that took place back then. And so, as a patron, he does this. Why? Because he has come to believe in the God of Israel. What's interesting is that Jesus responds to this. And you got to kind of think about this for a minute, because there's a lot of reasons why a Jewish person would not necessarily respond to something like this. For one thing, he has sent a request to come to see him. Well, where is this slave? More than likely, he's in the house of this centurion. This is a Gentile home. Jews don't go into Gentile homes. Why? Because it would render them unclean to do that. And so this is a request coming from a Gentile who seemingly wants him to come into his Gentile home to heal his slave. There are reasons to be hesitant about this. And I'm sure that the people around are very curious to see what Jesus is going to do. These things are not private. They are public. And you have to imagine this for a moment, because we like privacy. We tend to be private people. I mean, look at how we are in our homes. We shut the blinds and stay inside. It used to be that people would mingle in the neighborhoods. That's not as popular as it used to be anymore. We're private people. We don't like to go outside anymore. But back then, everything was public. Okay? This group of elders from the synagogue who come to Jesus, this is all publicly displayed. So there's people around. They see this. They witness this. They're curious to see what's going to happen, because Jesus is a Jew and this guy's a Gentile. You see, is he going to have to go into this Gentile's home? And when he does, how's Jesus going to take care of the problem that will result from doing this? It's interesting what happens. It says in verse 6, Jesus went with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to tell him something. And it's interesting because it says, "Don't trouble yourself, since I am not worthy to have you come under my roof," he says. "That is why I didn't even consider myself worthy to come to you." Do you see, in a similar way that we saw with Zacchaeus, do you see that this man is demonstrating his faith in Jesus as the Messiah, the anointed one of God? You can already see his faith being displayed in what he is saying, and how much honor and respect he bestows upon Jesus, recognizing that there is a religious barrier between him as a Gentile and Jesus as a Jew. He's respecting that, you see, in this encounter. He says, "But say the word, and my servant will be cured. You see what he's saying? Say the word, and my servant will be cured. For I too am a man placed under authority. All I have to say to someone, to one of my soldiers, is go, and he'll go. Or come, and he'll come. So, you see what he's saying? He's recognizing who Jesus is. There's no doubt in his mind who he is. You see. And Jesus hears this. And look at the text. It says he's amazed. He's amazed at him. And he turns to the crowd. This crowd's following him because they want to see what Jesus is going to do. He turns to them. And he says, I tell you, I've not found so great a faith even in Israel. You see. It's as if Jesus is saying to this crowd of people who've been following him around, you guys, look at this Gentile. You don't like these Gentiles. You stay away from them. But look at him. He is more like a Jew than you are. How do I know that that's what Jesus means? Because in Matthew's account of this, it gives us a little more detail. And Jesus says there are going to be people coming from the east and the west to sit down with Abraham at the banquet. But the sons of the kingdom are going to be thrown outside into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Who are they? They are the Jews, you see. Every Jewish person believed that because they were Jewish, they were going to be at the Messianic banquet one day. They believed that. Now, this doesn't mean they all thought they were worthy of it, but they believed by virtue of the fact that they were Jews, that the Jewish Messiah, that they would be a part of his kingdom and would sit down at this banquet. You hear what Jesus is saying? He's scolding the crowd in a sense, is he not? This guy is a Gentile, and his faith exceeds anybody's faith I've seen in the villages where I've been ministering. Remember, Jesus has been in the synagogues. He's been teaching in the synagogues in Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. In the book of Matthew, what does Jesus later say in chapter 11, I believe it is? What does he say about those cities, about those villages? They're not really cities. They're villages. Have about 1,500 to 2,000 people in each one of them. He says, woe to you, Chorazin. Woe to you, Bethsaida, Capernaum. And he pronounces curses on them because they saw more miracles than anybody else had seen, and yet they rejected Jesus. They rejected him, you see. Jesus' miracles, the miracles he performed, the acts that he did, 70 to 80% of them happened in that little 4-mile stretch there on the northwest part of the Sea of Galilee. They were privileged to see that. Yet, most of them rejected him. Here we have a centurion, a Gentile, who expresses his faith in Jesus. He believes in him. He believes in who he is. And he demonstrates it in the presence of all of these people. And Jesus says, I have not seen faith like this anywhere in Israel. And then it says in verse 10, when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Jesus heals him. He honors the request of this centurion. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves today is this: who are the Gentiles in our culture, in our community? Are there people that we exclude, that we don't think are worthy? As a church, we believe we are privileged by being graced because of the salvation we have received. Do we think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think? Every culture has their Gentiles. Who are the Gentiles in ours? Do we fail to see the value of those people? Jesus will have none of these divisions that existed in his time, in his culture. He will have nothing to do with it. He crosses boundaries left and right. In his encounters, he shows what God's love is like. God loves all people You see, he's not just concerned about one race of people. You see, he's calling all men everywhere to repent. And that's the message for us today from this text. And this is what we can learn by following Jesus and seeing the example that he gives to us today.